Hello, and thank you for joining us tonight at Aquarium of the Pacific. My name is Nate Jaros. I'm Curator of Fish and Invertebrates here at the Aquarium, and I'm here just to introduce a couple of our great lecturers tonight who have a really entertaining lecture in store. But first I want to acknowledge our sponsors, our in-kind sponsors for our lecture series, including the Courtyard downtown, the Courtyard at Long Beach downtown, and the Gazette newspapers. Also note that if you're watching this at home on YouTube, you won't be able to ask questions. We are going to have a Q&A session at the end, but to do that, you need to be watching on the Zoom link that you can find on our website on the event page. So feel free to watch on YouTube, but if you want to be involved in the Q&A, please switch over to the Zoom link on our website. Those will be in the Q&A section and not the chat tonight. But we're in for a real treat. Two of our biologists, Assistant Curator Danny Munoz and Senior Aquarist Briana Fodor, will be sharing all about Aquarium of the Pacific's involvement in the White Abalone Recovery Program. Danny and Briana have both been with the aquarium for well over a decade and have become experts in many areas of biology. However, their common interests in diving in cold, sometimes low visibility water, saving endangered species, and just a general interest in really cool sea snails brings them both here tonight to tell us about white abalone. Up first will be Danny Munoz. Danny, take it away.
All right, thank you, Nate. Well, good evening, everyone. As Nate said, my name is Danny Munoz, and I'm an assistant curator here at the Aquarium of the Pacific. And tonight I'm going to be joined by Briana Fodor, one of our senior aquarists, and we're going to be telling you all about the Aquarium of the Pacific's involvement in the White Abalone Recovery Program. Now, before we dive into this presentation, Briana and I thought it'd be very fitting to start tonight's lecture with a very special video. Now, some of you may have already seen this video, some of you may be seeing it for the first time. Regardless, we think you're in for a real treat. And we're just gonna show you a small portion of the video, but if you wanna check out the whole thing, we encourage you to check it out on YouTube under I Love Abalone at the Aquarium of the Pacific. And before we play this video, Briana and I also just wanted to send a quick shout out to Luke and Sarah and our entire education department for producing this truly one-of-a-kind video. So, without further ado, So not quite sure how we follow that video, right? But Briana and I are going to give it a shot. But if you haven't seen that, again, I encourage you to check out the whole video on YouTube. You won't be disappointed. So one of the first things I learned when I joined the White Abalone Recovery Program was that there's no shortage of acronyms related to this program. So you're going to see quite a few tonight, just a forewarning, and we'll do our best to try to explain some of them along the way. But as far as tonight's lecture, just to give you an idea of what we're going to be going over, we're first going to just give you a brief introduction to abalone. We'll talk about some of the threats that they're facing. We'll go into the plan to hopefully recover the species from extinction. And then Briana's going to come up and tell you a little bit about the work we do here at the aquarium, and that's going to include some of the spawning and what goes into raising these little snails. And then I'll come back and I'll tell you a little bit about the field work that's happening, and that's going to include my favorite part, of course, outplanting these little guys back into the wild. And then we'll wrap it up with, we'll just touch on what the future holds for white abalone. Now, when most people hear abalone, they usually think of these really beautiful, colorful shells. They're often used in jewelry and sometimes in home decor. Some of you may have seen these in random places, but they have just these magnificent colors that you can see here. But abalone are also a popular food option, and there are some sustainable fisheries and farms for certain species of abalone. But for us here at the aquarium, they're a very important animal in our oceans, and that's what we're going to be discussing with you all here tonight. So the best place to start is probably by answering really the basic question that we usually get here that people ask, and that is, what are they, right? Well, in simplest terms, they're really a big marine snail. Now, if you want to get a little more scientific, they're a mollusk, and more specifically, they're a gastropod. But we thought for tonight's presentation, we're just going to go with big marine snail because we think that sounds way more intimidating. So abalone are found worldwide. As far as our coast here, there's 7 different species that you can see listed there in that top photo. You'll also notice the ranges in that top photo. And what you'll notice right away is that the white abalone have pretty much the smallest range off our coast. You can see that's the white line all the way to the right. And then as far as the other photos there in the bottom left, it just kind of gives you a basic idea of the anatomy of abalone. But for the most part, it's going to be that foot that we call the foot, which is a really strong muscle that they use. And they use this to hold on to rocks and to kind of just hunker down to get away from predators. The other part, of course, as I mentioned before, is that shell, that hard outer shell. And then on the top there in that bottom right photo, you can see they've got those respiratory ports. And they use those, as you can imagine, not only to breathe, but they also use those to excrete waste and also to reproduce. And those ports also are one of the methods that we use to distinguish between species, as well as some other features and characteristics. But of course, for tonight's lecture, we're going to be focusing on the white abalone. So just a little bit about the white abs. They were the first marine invertebrate to be protected by the Endangered Species Act, and this was back in 2001. White abalone have a depth range of anywhere from about 6 to 200 feet. So they are one of the deeper species that you'll find. And they can reach a size of about 25 centimeters, so maybe about the size of a small dinner plate. They have a lifespan of about 30 years, and they can become sexually mature at around 4 years old, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. And as I mentioned, they're usually found on rocky banks where they'll just sit and consume different species of algae, and they don't really travel much. They can actually be found on the same rocks for weeks and even months without moving. So one of the big questions we ask ourselves is, why do we care about abalone, right? We hear this question quite a bit as well. What's their purpose? Why are they important? Why should we save them? Well, abalone, they have a cultural, an ecological, and an economical importance to the west coast of North America. They promote kelp forest diversity through their grazing. You can almost think of them as little kelp forest architects. But a kelp forest with abalone present is absolutely more resilient in the face of uncertain threats. And they're also an important food source for many other species, and we're also going to touch on that a little bit later as well. However, an increasing demand for abalone meat and shells led to an increased effort to harvest these animals in incredibly large numbers. You can see these photos here, but they just show the piles of shells that the abalone were up against this. They show the astounding number that would be harvested at one time. And one of the problems regarding abalone reproduction, which Briana is going to discuss again in more detail later, is that there needs to be several animals near each other during a spawning event to really maximize the chances for success. So as you can imagine, when numbers like this are being taken at one time, it really makes it difficult and challenging for this species to continue to reproduce successfully on their own. And then the white abalone in particular were specifically targeted as a delicacy because supposedly they have a particularly good flavor. But you can see this graph here kind of shows the white abalone being harvested in thousands of pounds from 1940 up until about 1997 when the fisheries closed. So essentially there was a 99% loss in a decade. So the demand for abalone nearly wiped out the entire population. And then now there's so few individuals left in the wild that the likelihood of a male and a female living within reproductive range is really almost zero. And then on top of dealing with human impacts, in the late 1980s, something else began to affect the abalone, but a disease called withering foot syndrome was discovered as the cause of death in many abalone. And it's a bacterial disease that affects the abalone's digestive tract, but it basically causes them to waste away and eventually die. And this, of course, contributed to even further reducing the number of abalone off our coast. But you can see in the photo there how that foot I mentioned earlier, it just shrinks and the animals essentially waste away and die. And then yet another issue the abalone are dealing with, poaching. And not only abalone, many species have to deal with this, but although abalone are no longer allowed to be fished in Southern California, poaching is still an issue and is added to the reduced numbers that we're seeing today. But you can see this photo here shows, I think, over 50 abalone shells that were seized by California Fish and Wildlife. So I think you get the picture. The abalone are just up against a ton of different issues. So it's no wonder why the numbers are where they are. And then I'm just going to touch on reproduction. I think Briana will also talk a little bit more about this in detail. But abalone have a pretty interesting reproductive method. As I mentioned earlier, they become sexually mature at around 4 years of age. But they are slow-growing animals, kind of similar to some corals. And like many corals, their method for reproduction is something that we call broadcast spawning. And what this means, and if you guys watch that I Love Abalone video, it explains it very well in there. But what it means is that males and females release sperm and eggs into the water column in the hopes of fertilization. Now, when this happens, it's not just one male and one female. All abalone in the area do this. So it's a very synchronized event. So you kind of need a lot of animals in close proximity for this to really be successful. So in the late 90s, the government decided to step in and put a halt on abalone fishing to hopefully recover the white abalone species. As you can see here in this slide, the first thing that happened was that the fishery shut down. I mentioned that earlier in 96 and 97. And then that was followed by placing the white abs on the endangered species list in 2001. And then also in that time frame, we began to collect broodstock animals, and these were going to be part of a research project for reproduction. And then you can see there in the early 2000s, there was some initial success with spawning, which was very exciting. And then in 2008, the White Abalone Recovery Program officially begins, and this is when the Aquarium of the Pacific gets involved. And it was initially 5 institutions, but has since grown to multiple partners. It's really, so many people were involved in this program, it'd be impossible to name everyone. So as I mentioned, in 2008, the aquarium officially joined the program, and that's when we received 8 individuals from those broodstock that I mentioned. And these animals were going to be used here at the aquarium for future spawning attempts. We received funding from NOAA, and this was to assist with the care of these individuals, but it was also to help us design and build a holding system that was going to be used for spawning and rearing these animals. And that's some of the stuff Briana will be sharing with you guys in just a bit here. But this list here, as I mentioned, includes some of the initial partners of the program, as well as many others that have joined since to really hopefully help save this species from extinction. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Briana. She's going to come up and she'll be discussing in more detail some of the work that we do here at the aquarium. And then I'm going to return and I'll talk a little bit more about the field work and some of the outplanting. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Briana. Briana?
Yep.
I'm back, and I'm actually going to sanitize things for Briana. are safe.
Awesome. All right, well, thank you, Danny, for getting it started. So what exactly does it mean for the Aquarium of the Pacific to be involved in our White Abalone Recovery Program? Well, first of all, we have white abalone here at the aquarium. We actually currently have over 80 white abalone. These all range in age from the age of 20 years old, which were some of those original broodstock that Danny had mentioned being collected or not original broodstock, but they were born back in 2001. And all the way down to some abalone that are 3 years old that were born here in 2018. As part of this, we have an abalone exhibit that the public is typically able to see when we are open to the public. On the left, we house our adult abalone. These include adult white abalone, but also adult red abalone. And the picture on the right is our juvenile abalone, the ones that were born in 2018. The great thing with these is this allows us to share with the public all about what we're involved with, the White Abalone Recovery Program, but it also helps to make people aware of these animals, because I'm sure there's many people that don't even know they exist till they come here, but also just to make people aware of how endangered they are and how there are lots of partners working to save them. So I thought I would take a couple slides real quick just to kind of talk a little more about what Danny and I do here at the Aquarium of the Pacific. By working in our Aquarist department. So we are responsible for the care of the fish and invertebrates that we keep here at the Aquarium of the Pacific. Me personally, I have 6 different exhibits here. So what that means is I'm responsible for the animals inside, including feeding, general observations, making sure that they are doing well and are healthy, but also making sure that their tanks are clean, the filtration behind the scenes is working properly, and is also kept maintained. So this here is a picture behind the scenes of that abalone exhibit I had shown earlier, just so you can kind of see where we're at. The really bright blue light that you see, that's actually the light that's illuminating the tank, so it's right above the water, and that's the way that I access the tank in order to feed the animals or clean inside the tank. So everything you see in this picture is everything that's running that one exhibit. Again, this helps to keep the tank itself clean, make sure the temperature's good, and most of this filtration requires almost weekly maintenance, if not more than once a week. So this is a fun picture, and this is my volunteer, Sandy. She's actually been in the aquarium a lot longer than I have, but she, in this scene, was very proud of herself for cleaning so many filter bags. So filter bags are a type of filtration that we use on our smaller exhibits. The water coming from the main tank goes through this filtration or this filter bag first before going back into the rest of the filtration. And what it does is it takes out the larger particles that are coming from the exhibit. So in terms of our abalone, we feed them a lot of kelp throughout the week, which means they poop a lot, to be honest. So these filter bags get fairly dirty, and actually part of my daily routine is just cleaning their filter bags. It's not this many, it's only 2, but I still needed to show a picture of this. Another big part of Danny's and my job is diving. This includes diving in our exhibits, either to care for animals, to clean the exhibits. We use sometimes really cool big power scrubbers underwater. This is kind of a fun picture of one of my coworkers with a big underwater drill that we can use to drill holes into rockwork. But also a perk for us of living, or for working on at an aquarium that's right on the coast, is we do get to go out in the field diving fairly often. So Danny and I are both scientific divers, so that means we participate in research dives, collecting dives, and this becomes really important for us to be able to help with that White Abalone Recovery Program in the future, which we'll get into a lot more detail later. So since I also care for the majority of our abalone here, I'm also in charge of getting kelp to feed them. So the main thing that we feed our abalone are kelp, or giant kelp, Macrocystis porifera, and we're actually able to take one of our boats just to the breakwall, which is about a 15-20 minute boat ride, and and we're able to collect it. So believe it or not, the breakwall actually is kind of a cool dive site. There's kelp, there's a huge diversity of animals, but it makes it fairly easy for us to obtain a really nice natural food source for our animals. You can probably tell in this picture, Valerie's wearing a mask. So even throughout COVID and quarantine, even when the aquarium was closed, all of our animal care staff was still here. We were still working because fortunately for our animals at least, they had no idea there was this huge pandemic going on outside the aquarium. So we kept our routines and kept doing everything throughout, including going out and kelp collecting. So I'm also responsible for our abalone culture system. This system is really important in terms of spawning our abalone. Like Danny was mentioning, the way that they reproduce is through spawning. However, when we do it in an aquarium, it's a lot more controlled. Ultimately, with the spawning and having abalone in captivity, the ultimate goal is to raise enough abalone or white abalone that eventually we're able to release them back into the wild. So this is a really important system in terms of that. So once a year, also kind of in relation to getting ready for a spawning event, we do an assessment of all of our abalone. This includes taking them all out of their exhibit, weighing them, measuring them, and also checking their gonad and kind of giving it a rating of, I guess, fertility. So each of our white abalone each have an individual tag and number tag on each of their shells. So this allows us to keep track of the abalone throughout the years and keep really good record of these animals. So a spawning event is a really planned and coordinated thing, again, ultimately to produce more baby white abalone that we'll eventually be able to put back out in the wild. So what we do, as Danny had mentioned earlier, there are male and female abalone. So we'll separate males and female abalone based on what we saw during their assessment into buckets. The picture on the left is a female abalone. She's surrounded by some of her eggs that she had released. And then the picture on the right is a male abalone, and he's currently releasing sperm. So kind of something cool about our spawning that we do at Aquarium of the Pacific is we actually coordinate it with another local aquarium called the Cabrillo Marine Aquarium. This is because typically when we're spawning animals, we don't necessarily get both a male and a female to spawn at the same time during the same spawning event. So what we're able to do is spawn at the same time as Cabrillo, which also has adult white abalone. And let's say Aquarium of the Pacific had all their males, or a male spawn, and the Cabrillo Aquarium had females. We can kind of we can drive their gametes over the bridges to the other facility and still achieve successful fertilization. So let's say we're super successful, we get both sperm and eggs. Then what we do is we actually mix them ourselves based on recommended concentrations of each. We only allow them to be mixed for a short amount of time because if multiple sperm fertilize the same egg, it kind of ruins the fertilization process. So we'll rinse the sperm out and hopefully end up with a successfully fertilized egg. So from there, this egg develops into an embryo. We put these embryos into the top part. If you look in that left picture, it's kind of above where our two staff are standing. Once they start to develop, they turn into these free-swimming plankton. They come out through tubes and down into these white buckets. So the bucket on the right has some of the larvae, the planktonic larvae swimming around. Even though you can't see it, it looks like really tiny dots. So here are just a few pictures of the fertilization, just so you can kind of get an idea of what these guys look like. Again, they, to the naked eye, look like little specks of dust in the water. So also as part of the culture system, we have these troughs. So the troughs have ceramic tiles in them, and throughout the year we allow a type of algae called diatoms to grow in them. This is what a very small baby abalone will first eat when they first settle. When we say settle, what that means is they go from their planktonic state into a state where they're able to actually attach onto something. In our case, it's onto these substrates or onto the trough. And this is a couple weeks usually after fertilization. So once we see them under the microscope and see that they've developed to that stage, what we'll do is pour the larvae into the troughs. And at that point, we kind of hope for the best. They're so small at that point, it's really tough to really see if we were successful until a few months or a little bit later. So again, these guys are real small. So you can see these are some abalone at 2 months old. But one thing that we can look for is their feeding pattern. So if you see on that that triangle at the bottom, that's diatoms, but the little white spots are probably from a tiny abalone kind of eating its way through some of the diatoms. So like Danny had mentioned earlier too, these guys are really slow growing. Here's a few pictures. We have some 4-month-old abalone in the left. The right are 1-year-old abalone. At about this point is when we can start trying to offer them what we feed them as adults or as they get larger, which is that giant kelp. Again, we've been successful and our partners have been successful. The Bodega Marine Lab over the past couple of years have been extremely successful and have raised thousands and thousands of abalone. Again, our ultimate goal for these is to raise them to a size that's big enough that we're able to outplant those out into the wild in areas we know white abalone live and have been successful. All right, so as I had mentioned earlier, diving is a big part of what we do at work, and we have a good staff of scientific divers, and so we have been able to assist with the field portion of the White Abalone program. Initially, this was mostly surveying. There were reports of adult white abalone at a location pretty close to the aquarium, so we were able to dive with partners such as NOAA and Fish and Wildlife and Bay Foundation, and go out and look for these abalone, and again, hopefully finding a place that's very suitable for abalone release. So these are some pictures from before. We used to, before COVID, charter a dive boat, and we would all go diving together, which I always loved, even when I wasn't part of the abalone program, just because seeing these people who are experts on abalone and are so passionate, it was always really a fun time for me to be around, and just learning straight from, again, the experts. So this is kind of a general view, just so you get an idea of where these dives were occurring in relation to the aquarium. No specifics, but it's in a general area off of Palos Verdes, and that's the black circle to the left, and then the Aquarium Pacific is located at that yellow star kind of on the right side. So not too bad, a pretty quick boat ride around the corner, and got us all to the survey sites that we needed to. So to give you an idea of how, what we were actually doing surveying, what would happen is we would first have a team go down underwater and lay down what we called a baseline. So we did this with a transect tape, which is pretty much a really, just like a long, not tape, yeah, a long tape measure. So it was a big long tape that had all the meters, different meters and lengths marked out on it. So the first team would go down. We would have compass headings telling us which direction to lay out these lines. So they would lay down that main line. Then each of the buddy pairs that were on the boat or at the site were given a different meter mark to survey. So they would go down to their mark on that first line, then use their compasses to put another line out perpendicular to that first line. And after we laid that out, we would survey about 6 feet on either side of the line itself. So in the end, hopefully, amongst all the teams, we got a really nice broad view and survey of the area that we were looking at. The top 2 pictures are from our most recent abalone dive, which was just back in November. You can see a lot of times it was very green, but this you could get a pretty good view. You can see us laying down the lines and then also bringing them back in these pictures. So this was a typical survey sheet that we would take with us on our survey dives. Again, at these initial dives, we were looking for adult white abalone that we had known were out there somewhere, but we were also looking at good habitats for potential release in the future. So we were looking for things like what type of algae was out there, so we needed appropriate food for our little abalone. We needed to see what kind of invertebrates, if their predators were out there, but also just a good idea of like how the bottom was. Was it rocky? Was it sandy? Was it big boulders? Again, in the end, we're still just kind of looking for something that we thought white abalone would find an appropriate habitat. Also, you can see on the right side, we did have an area for if we did see any adult white abalone, which I will say was very rare for even one to be seen on any of these dive days, especially when we were kind of looking around, but it was always exciting when we saw them. All right, so here's a video just to give you kind of an idea of typical conditions for a survey. I'll be honest, this is probably one of the better days. It was pretty clear, it wasn't too surgy. But you can see here we have our divers. They're, I think at this point, probably pulling in the lines that we were using for surveys. But yeah, it was pretty flat. There would be these big ridges every now and then, lots of algae. We would see multiple species of local California fish. I think some of the coolest things I've seen, we had one where we had a giant sea bass following us the entire dive. And I remember it just following the lines and going to each diver and just kind of checking everybody out. And I've even seen a 7-gill shark out in this area before, so that was pretty cool. So. All right, well, this will just show you just how hard it is to see a white abalone. So here it's getting zoomed in on an adult white that we had found. It's a little different looking than the rock sitting next to it. But then as we zoom out, you can kind of see really what the environment looked like. So this, again, was probably a more green, kind of murky dive day. But yeah, finding these guys was always really exciting. One dive, I laid my line right on an abalone, and it was very exciting. There's lots of underwater screaming, so it was good. All right, so in addition to looking for our adult white abalone and also looking at habitats, we conduct predator surveys. So we obviously don't really want to release a bunch of little tiny white abalone into an area if it's completely just covered with any of their predators. Here, for some of the 4 prime candidates that we were looking for, are California sheephead in the left corner, our spiny lobsters, the giant spine sea stars, and then probably the hardest one to find were the 2-spot octopus. I don't know if you guys can even see it. He's sitting right in the middle in that bottom left picture. So very good at camouflage. So here's just another survey sheet. This is actually the sheet that we used most recently after outplanting some abalone, but it's also one that we use for just those general surveys as well. So you can see at the bottom, same thing, we mark if we see any of these predators, where we've seen them along the lines, and we also just note any abalone that we see as well. One thing I didn't mention, I think Danny had mentioned it before though, is these adult white abalone at least don't move very much. So if we found a white abalone and we had really good coordinates on where it was and based on our surveys and our headings and everything, we could usually go back and find that same abalone even months later. All right, so we finished surveying. We kind of figured out some areas that we thought were going to be appropriate for outplanting. So the next goal is to figure out how are we going to outplant these guys. We're not going to just toss them over a boat. So what was developed was these SAFEs, it's called, a short-term abalone fixed enclosure. Danny's joke, more acronyms for him. So what these pretty much were just PVC frames with a conweb around the outside. They are then attached to a big concrete slab at the bottom, and they had a little flap at the top that you could open and close to access the inside of it. And then inside were different types of kind of hiding spots for the little abalone. So PVC, rocks, because the juvenile abalone tend to like to hide and go into kind of in really dark crevices and places. So these were made, but one cool thing was that we were actually able to test them. So what we did was we put these in 2017 into one of our exhibits called Amber Forest. This is it's a Southern California exhibit. It's a pretty similar temperature to what the abalone we're going to find when they're out in the wild. But the nice thing is we had no predators for abalone in there, so we were able to fill them with juvenile abalone, stick them at the bottom, and then just kind of see what the abalone did. So our goal is to make sure that, or try to make sure that they don't escape until we're ready for them to escape. Once we were comfortable with how long they had been in there, in the wild, what our plan would be to crack it open a little bit so that they could crawl out on their own. But before that, we wanted to keep them safe and away from predators. So we put them in. It was for a couple months. We fed them once a week with kelp. But the nice thing trying this out at the aquarium instead of the ocean is it's much easier to access. Weather is not a concern, getting out on boats. And we can even see them from the outside of the tank. So it was a really good trial. And I think everyone learned a lot from it. And it really helped us solidify the way that we were going to release them in the future. So with that, I'm going to let Danny talk about the more exciting part, which is when we actually got to start releasing all the abalone to the wild.
Thank you, Briana. Okay, so as Briana mentioned, we tested those safe modules in one of our exhibits in a more controlled environment. But now it was time and we're ready to move out to the open ocean. So you can see here in that top photo, divers putting one of those safe modules in place at the release site. So that's what it would look like, and that's what it looked like. And this is happening multiple times. So we had anywhere from 15 to 20 of these safes maybe out there. But that's what they look like, and then they're ready to receive little baby white abalone. And then the photo on the bottom there just kind of gives you another angle of that safe. But it also, if you look closely, that contraption in front of the safe with the 4 lead weights is actually a time-lapse camera. So we were able to set up these cameras to give us, and these cameras took a photo, I think it was about every 10 minutes or so. And then one of the partners were able to retrieve these periodically and download the footage. But these gave us a really good idea of what the abalone were doing when nobody was around, as well as predators. It gave us a really better understanding of what predators are doing when no one's around, since I'm sure you can imagine animals behave differently when divers are in the area versus when no one's looking. So those cameras have been incredibly helpful, and they've been very useful just to kind of guide us in the right direction with tweaking things here and there. So finally, in the fall of 2019, we had reached the point in the project that I know we had all been waiting for, but we finally were able to release juvenile white abalone back into the wild. So years of hard work by so many dedicated people finally paid off, and you can see there we released about 4,000 animals between 2 different sites here in Southern California. So I can tell you that was just a really exciting time. I think I mentioned before, but that's obviously my favorite part, as I'm sure it's for most of the partners. And this is it's a delicate process. Just to give you kind of a quick sense of how it goes, we take the juvenile labs, we place them in game bags, and then it's really as simple as swimming those down. After we determine how many and which abalone are going to go into which safe, each abalone is ID'd with a tag number, and each safe has a number as well. So there's a little bit of just logistics to figure out, but once we determine that, it's really as simple as swimming them down. We open up the safe, place the animals inside, and then we close the safe, secure it tight, and that's where they'll sit for anywhere from weeks to months, depending on how we feel they're adapting. So as I mentioned, once the animals are in the safes, I think Briana mentioned, but we would put algae in there initially so the animals had something to eat for the first few days or weeks. But we would conduct periodic dives to monitor them. And you can see here some of the gear that we use to look for the abs. There's the game bag I mentioned. We have that underwater slate with underwater paper that we use to record everything, calipers to measure animals. And then that's the Transect tape, the orange device there that Briana mentioned. That's basically a big tape measure that we use underwater. But these are the tools that each diver carries to complete the task. And the way it works is we initially place the animals in the safe. We add kelp, like I said, and then we allow them some time to acclimate to their new environment. Remember, these animals were raised in a lab setting. So it is important that we give them a little bit of time to get used to this new habitat before we officially release them from the safe. Since once those safes are open, they won't necessarily have the full protection of the safe. And then after enough time that we feel they've adapted, we'll slightly open the safes just by lifting them just a bit. I think I have a photo of that here in a second, but we lift them up just a few inches or so off that concrete slab Briana mentioned. And this kind of allows the abalone to crawl out at their leisure when they're ready, basically. But it also kind of doesn't allow predators to really get in easily. So it's kind of just, continuing that further acclimation process. So here's a photo of what I was just talking about, but here's an up-close shot of one of the safes. And you can see the concrete slab there, but the white PVC is lifted, like I said, maybe just a couple of inches off that slab. And this, again, allows the abalone to crawl out when they're ready. Those arrows are each pointing at a juvenile white abalone, so that's pretty exciting to see there. So those guys will crawl out when they're ready. Once they've adapted, they'll kind of just come out. And again, that little bit of opening, it makes it hard for lobsters and fish to really get to them. Octopus, as you can imagine, are pretty good at getting in tight spaces, so that's probably just something that they do have to deal with. But one thing we found too is eventually you may be wondering how long we leave that, but eventually the top of the safe is completely removed and that comes back to the surface. However, that concrete slab we do leave for a little while. We have found that the abalone like to take shelter underneath that slab, so that still offers some protection from predators and things like that. But we've not only seen abalone on the underside of these slabs, we've also seen them much further away on rocks and on the reefs, in crevices, and that's a great sign. That just means that obviously they've traveled, they're adapting, they're likely grazing algae along the way, and that's ultimately what we want to see. We want to see those animals moving away from the safes and just kind of becoming part of the ecosystem out there. And the hope would be eventually that these animals grow up over the next few years and they would eventually become part of that annual spawning party that we talked about. So, and then the ultimate hope would be that they become a self-sustaining population. So we do this enough times and we get enough abalone to survive and they eventually become a self-sustaining population would be the ultimate goal with the white abalone. So one other area that we wanted to mention that the aquarium has also been assisting with is in conducting nutritional analysis on some of the white abalone's primary natural diet. And those are going to be, they eat a variety of algae, but mostly what we've been working with is agarum that you can see in that photo on the top there. And then Briana mentioned macrocystis in the photo there at the bottom. These are pretty common in our waters here off Southern California. If you're a diver, you've most likely encountered both of these algae. But for the last several years, we've been sending samples out to a lab to test for different categories that you can see listed there on the side. And we do collect this algae from the actual site, the release site where the abalone are. We also bring some back, as Briana was talking about, to feed our animals here at the aquarium. But the purpose of this is for a couple of reasons. It not only kind of gives us a better understanding of how to tailor our diets here at the aquarium for our animals, but it also gives us an insight into what wild abalone are taking in and what some of their natural requirements are. So it is really good, useful information. And one interesting note that we've seen is that there is some seasonal variation in both species of algae. Depending on many different environmental factors. So we know it can fluctuate throughout the year, so that was kind of interesting to see. And then here's just a quick example of some of that data I was just talking about, just put into a graph form. But I believe this is for macrocystis, which is probably one of the more common algae off our coast here. But you can see the different measurements for things like proteins, iron, calcium, etc. And again, like I said, this not only gives us a really good idea of what wild abalone are taking in, but it helps us to ensure that we're offering the best food option for our animals, not only back here at the aquarium, but at other holding facilities. Obviously, we can share this information and data with all the other partners. So what does the future hold for white abalone? This is a pretty cool photo here. I just wanted to mention at the top, some of you may have seen this, I think it was on Facebook or Instagram, but these are small white abalone being loaded up in a cooler into a private plane. They actually got to charter a private plane down from Northern California. And the animals in that cooler are actually some of the ones that were used in the outplanting. So that's kind of cool. And then that's a great photo there at the bottom, up close of a white abalone. If you look really close, he's wearing pilot headgear, and I'm still not sure how they got him to sit still for that, but that's a really neat photo. But as far as the future, well, our grant here at the aquarium was recently renewed for another 3 years, so we're super excited about that. That's just going to allow us to continue to do the great work that the aquarium has been conducting here. And then, of course, we're going to continue to care for our current collection. And then we've also got some new animals coming from one of the partners in just a couple of weeks. So our collection here at the aquarium is going to grow. And this is all kind of leading up to an upcoming spawning that we're preparing for. And then, of course, we'll eventually, or as far as field surveys, as you can imagine, all that's kind of been put on hold due to COVID. We're just starting to figure out a way to get back out. But we'll eventually begin monitoring again and conducting field surveys and hopefully get back out and see how these little snails have been doing this whole time. And yeah, we're excited to hopefully get back out and just find them again and see how the numbers are doing, and hope that they've been thriving this whole time while we've been stuck back here at the aquarium. And with that, Briana and I would like to thank all of you for tuning in this evening, as well as thanking everyone involved in this program. It's just way too many people to name, but of course all the partners that are involved. And then we wanted to thank the whole team here at the aquarium for all the support. And lastly, of course, the White Abalone, thank all of you guys for tuning in tonight. So thank you.
Great work. Great work, Danny. Briana, do you want to join us on stage? So yeah, if anybody's watching at home, if you have questions for Briana or Danny, feel free to put them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your Zoom link. We did get a few questions. The first one maybe being, what species of abalone can you see if you visit the aquarium?
Briana, you want to answer that since
Yeah.
you take care of them?
Sure. So we have two species here currently. So we have the white abalone, which is what we've been talking about, but we also have red abalone, which they're a species that are not endangered. So they're a little bit better off, especially more up north, more San Francisco area. But we currently have both of those species here.
Any consideration of adding any other species like green abalone, which can be found abundantly here in Southern California?
I mean, obviously, more abalone would be wonderful.
The more the better, right?
The more the better.
Okay, and what about the 7 abalone that you mentioned? You say that reds are maybe not as endangered as some of the others. Is it pretty common for there to be trouble with these abalone species as far as their numbers go?
Yeah, I think during everything that Danny had mentioned, I think that really affected all abalone at one point, especially the overfishing and withering foot disease. I think it's the white abalone and the black abalone are the two most endangered species, but in the end, they all really took a hard hit with all of that. So.
Yeah, I think most of them are either endangered, like Briana said, or listed as a species of concern or threatened in some way. So they all definitely have some sort of label where they, wouldn't say they're fully thriving out there.
Okay. You mentioned the black abalone. One of our viewers commented that they remember seeing black abalone as one of the most abundant species in our local waters here, but over the last 20 years haven't seen any. So, I mean, do you think that they face the same threats that the white abalone? They don't really share the same habitat.
Yeah, I had a friend who that was what she did her research on, was on black abalone. So I remember her poking around off our coast because they're a much more shallow abalone species. So I think they were easier to harvest just because of how much more shallow they are. But I remember her saying she's been seeing them, and I think they're starting to come back. I think in general, all abalone, it sounds like, are coming back and trying to make an effort. So. But
that seems to be like very typical. You hear, most people that grew up in Southern California and kind of lived here a long time, you always hear stories that, when they were growing up, there was abalone everywhere. And that's not only abalone, it's specific to abalone. It's like that for a lot of species, fish and invertebrates. But, I think humans did some things, and, it's probably up to us to kind of, like I said earlier, have some sort of role in saving some of these species. But yeah, you hear that quite a bit, that, when I was growing up, these animals were everywhere. And that's pretty common for a lot of animals.
Great. Is there a particular time of year that abalone are released, or is there a particular time that they spawn each year?
As far as the release, I think it probably more than anything has to do with ocean conditions, for one. We definitely want to try to time it with that better time of the year when we know we can, as I mentioned earlier, once we release them, we kind of need to be able to do those periodic monitoring dives. So we want that better part of the year as far as weather. And And then as far as the spawning, it's usually, I believe, about once a year, but I think they can do it a couple times a year. I'm not entirely sure if there's a specific time of year when they would do that. But, usually animals, when they do spawn or reproduce, they've kind of developed, just with evolution, they've figured out that if they're going to have babies, there needs to be food for the babies. So they usually, it seems to coincide when there's good algae, and it's not a time of year where the algae is just kind of depleted. So we found that to be true with other, like signathids and things like that. They usually time spawning and reproduction with making sure there's food for their offspring.
Okay. Is there an ideal size to release an abalone to give it the best chance of survival?
Yeah, you definitely, and again, since we've only really done this once, we don't have a ton of data, but as far as the size that we released, you probably saw in that one photo, but they were probably maybe about a silver dollar size, or maybe a golf ball, if that gives you a better idea. But that's kind of the size that we've been releasing. So I think where we're at now is, we're going to continue to do these dives and see how the abalone are doing. And if it looks like it's been successful, we'll probably keep it going. If it looks like our numbers are not where we would want them, maybe we, go back to the drawing board and try a bigger size, a smaller size. But as far as what we started with, it's about the size of a golf ball.
Okay. Is there an opportunity for recreational divers to be involved, or what should they do if they find an adult white abalone, or what should they do if they find one a shell that has a tag on it?
That's a good.
I know. I was like, I might be wrong, but isn't that initially how we found that there were white abalone off our coast? It was from recreational divers and just people out diving and seeing these animals. But I don't know. Yeah, now.
Yeah,
currently.
we have such a great, strong dive community here in Southern California. So I think they could definitely be a resource. I think if someone sees a white abalone and they're like 100% sure, we'd like to know about it. Sure. I mean, if they truly have coordinates and they feel pretty confident, like I said, it's pretty difficult to ID these guys. So that there's a very good chance you're looking at another species thinking it's a white, but if someone feels 100% sure that they're looking at a white, we certainly would like to know about it. It could be one that we already know about. I think Briana mentioned a lot of the adults that we've found, we do have coordinates on these animals, and we do go back months later and they're sitting in the exact same spot and they haven't moved. As long as algae is there's really no reason for them to leave. But yeah, I think the dive community could definitely be a good resource.
Yeah, and Danny had put up all those great partners that are part of this. I'm sure if anybody could look up a phone number, an email address of one of those institutions and let them know, especially if you have a photograph, we could certainly put that to use. But I would say, yeah, just record those GPS coordinates when you're on the boat and share that information. It might be very useful for this recovery program.
Yeah, that's a great point. If you happen to have a camera, getting a good shot of it, that'd be a great way to kind of communicate that to one of the partners. Okay,
and on that note, with these safe enclosures that are out there, do you know, is there any problem with tampering? Has there been any instances where somebody's tried to see what's inside?
Yeah, as far as I know, there hasn't been any tampering. I haven't heard that anyone's found them or come across them. I don't think we gave any specifics tonight, so we're always kind of vague, right? But no, I haven't heard of that. So, and then I think I mentioned, but the safes are they're only out there for a short period of time. We certainly don't want the animals to get too accustomed to living in those modules because then they don't really learn how to survive once they're exposed. So the safes are really just for a short time. Like I said, maybe a few weeks or a month or so. But the goal is really to get them out of those safes and into that natural setting, because ultimately that's where they're going to be tested the most.
Okay. And there's a question how you described that they have to be a certain number of meters apart to effectively reproduce. Are there any methods to try to build a local colony and release abalone in a small group so that they can reproduce with each other in the wild?
Yeah.
Go for it.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, like the spot that we ultimately picked actually had probably the most like adult white abalone too that we would see in a given transect area. So I mean, I think us releasing all these juveniles into that area. First of all, we know that white abalone are there and they're happy already and have been there for however many years. So yeah, I think that's what we're doing right now is trying to release abalone into those areas where we know they do well and hope that they eventually spawn and create their own babies. So yeah.
Yeah, I think Briana touched on it, but you know those habitat surveys we did and those predator surveys and field surveys, that was years we did that, I believe, and you know we just had stacks of data sheets that you know the partners at NOAA and some of the other partners probably I don't know how much time they must have spent going through those data sheets, but the site that was chosen obviously was not, you know, we weren't just throwing a dart at the wall. It was definitely a carefully thought out process, and we surveyed a really large area. I forget off the top of my head, but that ultimately was chosen as the ideal spot, but it was you know, a mixture of many reasons why that spot was chosen, including finding adult white abalone, since, as you can imagine, that's the ultimate prize. If you're seeing adult white abs, then that's the ideal spot to think about releasing animals.
Okay, just one more topic. There's some curiosity about abalone in the menu or in the at restaurants. If you see an abalone on the menu, is there a way that we know that it's been sustainably sourced?
It's a good question. I think I mentioned earlier, but there's abalone farms, and I think it's mostly red abalone
I think so, yeah.
that those farms are reproducing. So you can certainly, you know, inquire as to where these abalones were acquired from. I don't know if they could tell you the species. I think the chances are it's probably a red if you're seeing it on a menu. But yeah, I mean, I don't think there would be anything wrong with trying to investigate a little bit as to what exactly you're ordering. But if you're ordering red abalone, it's as I said, there is a sustainable farm for red abalone, so that wouldn't be an issue.
Okay, I'll leave it at this. Have either of you had abalone?
So I'm allergic to shellfish. So no.
Easy answer.
Yeah.
I haven't either, so.
Okay.
But I am not allergic to shellfish. I would not be opposed if it was sustainably farmed.
All right,
So.
fair enough. Okay, well, I think we'll leave it at that as we wrap up the hour here. I wanted to thank our great lecturers, Danny and Briana. I wish we had a room full of people. We could give them a round of applause, but I'll give them a mini one. Thank you so much. If you're interested, please continue to check our website for upcoming lecture opportunities that you can tune into. So thanks for coming. Have a great evening. Oh, if we're still here, our next lecture, as Adina, our great lecture organizer, has told me, is on penguins on March 4th. Just hot off the presses.